In the last video, I talked about how a lot of people are leaving the UK, and that's people from like all sort of classes, but especially millionaires. The UK is actually the single country that's losing the most millionaires per capita in the world. And obviously, that's a very weird thing to see because historically, millionaires have mostly been living just overall developing countries. So people would leave Brazil or China or India, and they would, set up those typical local businesses that you see so commonly all around the world, like a little Lebanese shop, a little, a little Indian market or whatever. And it would be like just regular, everyday, but sort of well-off people from those developing countries that were not satisfied with government, they're not satisfied with structure, with life, and they moved into like en masse to the UK, to Australia, to New Zealand, to the US, to Canada, to most parts of Europe. And to see now the UK as not only one of the countries that has a net loss of millionaires, but also in the country that per capita is losing the most, that's definitely something that we haven't been seeing at least in the last 50 to 100 years. And on the other side of things, there's definitely countries that are gaining millionaires, and that is a good sign for most countries, because if people with money are coming in, regardless of your political position, first of all, they bring money, and that money is going to be spent, even if not all of the money is spent, on things, on products, on labor, on employees, on a cleaning lady for the house, and that obviously warms up the economy, brings more money in. Also, a lot of the millionaire population, like a good chunk of them, are competent and skilled, and normally there's a reason why they're millionaires, right? And so they can bring those skills with them as well. And of course, on top of that, a lot of them, when they move, it's very common for you to open a new business or sector or enterprise related to your previous business in the country that you're moving to, and that obviously generates jobs and again warms up the economy. So it is overall a good thing for countries that are receiving those millionaires. And we have a list, obviously it varies every year, but overall the 5 countries lately that have been on top of the list are Australia, the US, Singapore, the UAE, and Switzerland. And I've made a few videos about it, about the best countries to move in the West. And you're going to notice that all of those countries that I mentioned in my previous videos are also within those top 5. So I mentioned in those previous videos Australia, Switzerland, and the US as countries that are still worth immigrating to, even if you're not a millionaire, even if you don't have as much money, because just wages are disproportionately high and taxes are relatively low when compared to most other developing countries. And just as countries like full of opportunity. I've been to all those 3 countries. I live in Australia right now, and I have traveled a lot, and I have met a lot of people from all over the world. And you can definitely see that on average, the average Australian, the average American, the average Swiss sort of won the lottery in terms of like where they ended up being born in. And it's very interesting to see that those are the same countries that rich people were moving to, because we have a perspective that countries that are good for the middle class are not good for the rich, and vice versa. And that could be kind of true. For example, a set of countries that's not here in the list is the Nordic countries, and they're notoriously known for being good for the middle class. So there's some exceptions, but overall there is a fairly large overlap where I do believe that if you're just an average worker and you're not a millionaire, moving to Singapore might be a great idea. To Dubai, a little less so, but still it's definitely up and coming. And those 3 countries, other countries that I mentioned, Switzerland, the US, and Australia, if you live in any of them, except for maybe Switzerland, you might not perceive them as being a low tax country, but they actually are. In most countries, capital gains, not capital gains specifically, but just capital revenue and income is taxed nearly at the same rates as most other types of income. And in the US, in Australia, and Switzerland, well, in Switzerland, capital gains are not taxed at all. In Australia, capital gains are taxed at half of the rate. And then in the US, they're taxed at a lower rate, so between 15, 20, or 25%, but most people stay below 20%, so either 20 or 15. And that is it's just a overall good thing for people who a large percentage of their money is coming from exactly that, from capital. But even in terms of like income brackets, in Australia, in the US, in Switzerland, if you Google any tax calculator and you put in the same salary in those three countries, they're going to be like across the board, low income, middle income, and high income. People are going to pay lower taxes than in most other places, for example, in Europe, or even in some developing countries. And the reason for that is, well, I guess they can't afford it, you know? People are still moving in, and it's kind of a double-edged effect where, of course, people move in, which brings more money, which means that taxation doesn't have to be as high in terms of like per person. And then since taxation isn't that high, then more people move in, and that is like a cycle that keeps reinforcing itself. Like I said, unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity of living in the US, of living in Switzerland. I would definitely like to do so. This year in Australia has been really, truly instructive for me. But I would definitely, if I were rich, if I'm not, but if I were rich, I would definitely consider moving to one of those three countries, moving to Singapore or moving to Dubai, depending mostly on what your vibe is, really. And I think Singapore obviously is very attractive. Probably Singapore is, say, one climate, one type of life kind of country, you know. Same for Dubai. Whereas like, especially in the US, you can just have your cake and eat it too. You can be there and you can be in such different climates. There's virtually every single combination of political ideology, geography, and climate that you can possibly think of across all of the 50 states. So that's very attractive as well. And Australia obviously tries to mix up, I've already talked about this in other videos as well, it tries to mix up a little bit of the US and the European model, and it does that with a very, very high rate of success, to the point where definitely on the lower end of things, wages in Australia are probably higher than wages in America even. And there's superannuation here. There's a lot of things that are very, very interesting that most of the world should model. But due to its it's not low, but relatively low compared to developed countries, tax brackets, or at least marginal rates that actually start higher up, it's also a good country to grow a business or to grow your wealth. Not as good, I would say, as Singapore or the UAE or even the US and Switzerland, but still reasonably well. And one thing that you have in Australia that you don't have, especially in Switzerland and even in the US, is well, first of all, the climate, because it is probably one of the best climates in the world. I live in Melbourne right now, and Melbourne is known in Australia as one of the bad weather kind of cities. It does not have bad weather. It has some kind of rough winters that aren't even really that rough if you have good insulation, and for half the year the weather's just beautiful. So when you compare it to like the Nordics, for example, it wins like tenfold. And then also it beats the US very, very strongly in terms of being less controversial, less political, let's say. I think in Australia it is still kind of a taboo to talk about politics as much, and what you get from that is just a nicer, more quieter culture where you're not constantly like waving out flags or like wherever your political party is, you're just more discreet about it. So that's definitely something that is convenient. That's good. Obviously every country has its problems. Like I said, Australia in terms of salaries, just on a raw basis, it's probably still lower than even Singapore, but especially than Switzerland, the US. It doesn't really have mountains, so if you like to ski, that might not be a good thing, and it's really, really far away contrary to especially Switzerland, the UAE, and Singapore, where location is like they're really top notch. Some parts of the US, if you're, for example, in the Pacific Northwest, you might feel a little isolated in terms of like global travel, especially if you're in Australia, if you're in Perth, if you're in Melbourne, if you're anywhere in Australia except maybe for Darwin, you're not exactly going to be as well connected. But yeah, I want to hear from you guys. Would you move? I know about 15% of people who watch this channel are Americans, and a little lower, around 8%, are Australians. So I would love to see, because normally people have bad vision of their own country. So whenever I talk about Australia or the US or Switzerland in a good light or even in a neutral light, people will be like, nah, but that's not actually true, and inequality and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And I think that's just a poorly perceived notion that arises from not having any idea how bad the other countries are. I think that's mostly how it is. But I would love to still hear your opinions and your comments. So comment down below, and I'll see you guys around.